Accountability is our working in right relationship. So we don't come to the table as though we have the answers, but we come to the table to establish partnership. If we're doing justice, that justice has to be defined by the people who have been experiencing the injustice.
Hi, this is Aisha Hauser. I'm a minister at the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and this is our podcast. I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I hope this inspires you, hope it builds your faith, hope it gives you perspective to experience the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Hola, mi gente. Hello, everybody out in Unitarian Universalist land and beyond. Welcome to the Voices of Unitarian Universalism, The View. We are so excited that you are here today to talk about some of our favorite principles, our 7th and 8th principles, and the connection between them. I am Cristina Rivera. I am one of the co-leads of the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and I'm coming to you from Puerto Rico.
Hola, Chris. This is Michael Tino joining you from Peekskill, New York.
We have guests with us. We have Tharp, the Director of Programs and Partnership at the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth, also known as UUMFE. She manages the denomination-wide Create Climate Justice Initiative and is a member of the UUA Side with Love organizing strategy team. Ali lives in Austin, Texas, and is a member of the Wildflower UU Church. She's also a core volunteer with the Festival Beach Food Forest, which is an edible and medicinal landscape on public parkland in East Austin. That sounds really interesting, as well as Serafina Food Pantry. And also joining us is Paula Jones, who many of you know is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist and a management consultant with over 20 years experience designing and facilitating workshops and dialogues for leaders and organizations. She is an innovator in institutional change. In 1999, Paula founded ADORE, which stands for A Dialogue on Race and Ethnicity. And her work includes being a leader in advancing the 8th principle and community of communities as practices of the beloved community. Paula is an author of UU World magazine cover story, Reconciliation as a Spiritual Discipline. She's also editor of a Skinner House book, which is called Encounters, Poems About Race, Ethnicity, and Identity, and is also a contributing author to 3 Skinner House books, including the UUA Common Read, Justice on Earth. Welcome, Paula and Ali. We're so excited you all are here. So I'll start with, what do you all see as the intersection between the 7th and 8th principle? Paula, you want to start us out?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were doing your introductions that we probably should say what those principles are. And the 7th principle is our respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we all are a part. The 8th principle speaks to us being on a spiritual journey by building a multicultural, diverse, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and oppression in ourselves and in our institutions. So I just want to put the principles out there. There certainly is a direct connection between the 2 principles. And I want to say in a space or in a world where color blindness is kind of the status quo, we can have our principles and we can have the 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we all are a part, but that principle won't necessarily include all of the people and the perspectives that are a part of that interdependent web of existence. In fact, I share with people, it was the 7th principle that just made me so keenly aware that we needed something else, because for some of us, that interdependent web of existence also includes this very diverse, multicultural, not just community, but world in which we live. But that doesn't translate that way for everyone. For some people, the seventh principle is about the environment. And so you can have situations where we make heroic efforts to save animals while there are people who are in great need, and that can just be left out of the equation if we interpret the seventh principle as environment. The other piece about that is that we will not have healthy human communities unless we have a healthy, sustainable environment, and vice versa. So there is a direct relationship for all of us in the way that we use the land and our natural resources and our own well-being and longevity, actually. Allie, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Thank you, Paula, for starting us off. So UU Ministry for Earth, we are committed to grounding our work in environmental justice, meaning looking at racism and classism and other oppressions and how they play into the way that we interact with as human beings and exploit the environment, or within our economic paradigm have created these intersecting issues where the communities that are the most polluted, the most poisoned, the most dangerous to live in are those of communities of color and low income people of all races and ethnicities. So at Ministry for Earth, we find in order to really take a Unitarian Universalist approach to respect for the web of life, we can't ignore those connections. If we're really grounded in our faith principles and how we do our environmental work, then this needs to be a lens at which we build the community and organize among ourselves and each other, and in relationship to those who are most affected, to do environmental work, to do climate work. And so that's one of the key ways that these things are interconnected. One of my favorite words in the eighth principle is accountability. And what does it mean to be accountable? That's really, really important, both when we think about doing multicultural justice work and also in how we think about our relationship to the earth. So I got into climate and environmental activism almost 10 years ago in 2012 with the tar sands blockade fighting the Keystone XL pipeline. And I had come from a very privileged corporate suburb of Dallas where there was really no education, no grounding for me in what environmental justice and environmental racism was about. So I really jumped in the deep end and got a crash course in these issues by finding myself on the southern end of a pipeline that was poisoning First Nations, the Athabasca Chippewayan Nation, with the Alberta tar sands in Canada, as well as the communities in Houston where these refineries live. And part of the ethos of that campaign was to be accountable to these communities in how we worked and to be accountable to the land, that these are neighborhoods and people who are deeply rooted in where they are. And that was a completely new concept for me. So it really transformed my life to ask that question, like, what place am I accountable to and what community am I accountable to? And it changed the way I oriented to where I live in Texas and my commitment to both land-based struggles and community justice struggles. I also want to lift up that I think it was 4 days ago, the 24th of October in 1991 was the first National People of Color Leadership Summit in 1991 that established environmental justice principles for policy in the United States. So it's been 30 years. That convergence was done in partnership with the United Church of Christ, and they've been, a leader for 3 decades in helping people see these intersections between environment and race and class justice issues. So I just want to celebrate how far we've come in the past 30 years, the fact that we have just had that anniversary, and also just name that we still have so far to go in reaching environmental justice in all our relations.
And let me say, too, that regarding environmental justice, BIPOC communities had to fight and still do have to fight for environmental justice, just like civil rights and everything else, that you cannot take it for granted. We have to fight for it. We have to work to sustain it. That needs to change. And if we are really living out our principles, and if we are living out the eighth principle in addition, then we do that work. So when you talk about accountability, Allie, it's interesting because for some people, accountability is the one piece of the eighth principle that is problematic. And for others, that's where the real power is. And thank goodness there are a lot more people who are inspired by having a principle that really calls us into action. So it's not enough just to think, good things about inclusion and fairness. You've got to do something about it. Let me say one more thing. You talked about the 30-year anniversary. Next year is the 25th year since the Unitarian Universalist Association voted to become an anti-racist association. That should be a big year for us. But think about that. 25 years is a long time. We just got to do this. We got to make it happen.
Just listening to you all talk about this, one of the things I love is when parts of our principles feed off of and inform each other. And sometimes that's internal to principles, right? So like freedom and responsibility in our search for truth and justice balance each other in a certain way. And I'm thinking about the ways in which interdependence and accountability feed off of one another. How is accountability changed if we also recognize our interdependence? And how is interdependence changed when we recognize our need to be accountable to those who have less institutional power than we do?
Yeah, Michael, you're almost naming, I think, a spiritual aspect of the difference between exclusion and inclusion. How do you have interdependence if you're not inclusive? The eighth principle is about our commitment to doing the work of justice and inclusion.
And I wonder if you could speak, Paula, a little bit more about what accountability actually looks like in congregation and community, because I think that's one of the parts of the eighth principle that I think folks sometimes get stuck on.
So first, I think we have to disarm the word accountability. And I look at it as accountability is what we measure, why we measure it, and how we measure it. Right? Now that can be applied anywhere. So the word accountability in itself is not loaded. What's loaded is what people project onto that word. And if a person is holding accountability as some kind of punishment or something like that, then yeah, there might be a reaction to accountability. But in the justice arena, accountability is our working in right relationship with people who are collaborating, people who are usually more negatively impacted by an action, decisions, policies, whatever. So accountability is that we don't come to the table as though we have the answers, but we come to the table to establish partnership and to see, what is it that we can bring to help to move whatever it is forward. If we're doing justice, that justice has to be defined by the people who have been experiencing the injustice. And so that's the kind of accountability we're talking about. If accountability is coming from your sense of your corporate life or your work or whatever, then, it's like you've got to do certain things to please the people who have the authority in the association. Our work in justice, it might include some of that, but that is not what centers accountability for us. And it would be specific, situational. So accountability in one situation is something different than accountability in another, but it's discovered in the collaboration and in the outcomes. Are they satisfying our call to justice? Allie, do you want to respond to that?
Thank you, Paula. I hear like the two layers. For me, the relational aspect of it is kind of the centerpiece, and kind of back to this interconnectedness. How deep is our interconnectedness? How deep are we committing to be in relationship with one another, interconnected? And in this context, in the context of environmental racism, of climate injustice, it gets down to like, am I committed to changing myself and my life and my community and our governance and economic structures so that you can survive, so that you don't have to live a life of struggle and like living at risk just as your baseline? Like, that's, unfortunately, we've created systems that perpetuate that on a global scale, and it's being exacerbated because of the climate crisis. So we're seeing this play out with the UN climate talks that begin next week in the small island nations, these communities that, if we aren't accountable to the commitments that we've made to keep global warming and climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius, some of these nations will be underwater. So in that sense, to be accountable to the global pledge on 1.5 degrees, I think it gets diluted in the technical and policymaking process. But at the root of this, it's really, on that spiritual level, like, are we committed to each other's lives and thriving? So I see that as kind of like that spiritual core of why environmental justice is important to Unitarian Universalism. It's also that principle we have around equity and compassion in human relations. If we really want equity, then we need to change systems that make it so that the color of your skin is the biggest indicator on whether your community is polluted. And that's the world we live in right now, and it has to change.
Yeah, let me give you another example of accountability. And I'm tying this to something that I feel a sense of urgency around now. And that is that I don't think we will ever get climate change under control unless we are protecting the basic civil rights of people in this country. And we can look at that in terms of voting rights. And I want to tie this to accountability because, one, I don't know how much we've examined it. And two, I think it's a difficult thing to look at. The restructuring of voting in this country, whether it's through changes in terms of the polls, who can get there, all of these rules and requirements, gerrymandering, all of those things that are really designed to stop people from going to the polls and target people of color, the BIPOC communities in particular, also catching up in that net, young people and older people and all of those things that are being done will stop people who will vote in the best interest of the common good. So we cannot do the work around climate change. We're not holding the country or our elected officials accountable to climate change if we ourselves are not accountable to making sure that everyone gets to vote. And I don't think we're doing that. And we can back it up and look at the election of 2000. Voter disenfranchisement got a new structure. And that was also the same time that climate justice, environmental justice would have been brought forward as a national priority. So that was the election between George Bush and Al Gore. Al Gore had this as a priority. Voter disenfranchisement was very deliberately put in place, and that stopped Gore from winning the election. So the climate change work went on the back burner. Why? Because we did not assure people's right to vote and assure that their votes counted. So we can trace it right back to 2000, and there are things that have been written about it. And if you take a look at what's happening now, how many years is that? 20-something years? And it's on steroids now. So let's talk about accountability under those circumstances. You've got climate change, you've got voting rights, you've got racism, which includes mass incarceration, That is also a way of controlling the electorate. All of those things come together, and yet we wonder, how do we get climate change under control? We have to elect people who care enough to make that happen. Folks are working to make sure that those elections will not happen. So are we being accountable to people whose voting rights are being taken away or threatened? Some are, yes, but not enough of us are. And by the time we feel the sense of urgency, it'll be too late if it's not already too late. I rest my case.
Yes, I struggle with a lot of hopelessness living in Texas, in what you're saying, Paula, in the lack of accountability, the lack of democracy in our governance in Texas. And I think earlier this week, Governor Abbott here in Texas signed the new gerrymandered voting districts, and 95% of the population growth in our state is among people of color, and somehow one fewer district is majority people of color in the new maps that Texas has just passed. So it's so explicitly racist in what they did. And you know, when you layer the climate story of what's happening in Texas on top of that, February of this year, 2021, we lost power, and some people lost water. Some people lost their homes completely in a climate fueled winter storm. And the government of Texas was, you know, responsible for getting our energy grid to winterize. And it's come out recently that there's a loophole in the law that they've passed where a gas company can file a paperwork with our railroad commission, which is actually what regulates pipelines and the energy infrastructure altogether, will accept like $150 from a natural gas plant, and then they don't have to winterize. They don't have to be accountable for keeping an energy grid that can power people's basic needs through this rapidly changing climate changed environmental context that we're in. Just to give an example of what Paula is saying, what the impacts of the dilution of our rights are, we feel it really starkly right now here in Texas. And I do want to say, just to speak to the UU the Vote campaign that we had last year, UU the Vote is not over, and there will be more efforts in 2022 to continue what we can to connect these dots. And despite the hopelessness we may feel, we can't just resign ourselves to like, okay, this is our reality. Our democracy's broken, our climate's broken, and do what you can today. We have to balance living with joy and whatever hope we can find, but we can't just resign ourselves to this future, because we are accountable to future generations as well. We're accountable to life on this planet.
And we do have examples in our US history of being able to do this work, right? To being able to pressure individual states into doing the right thing, even when they don't want to. And I think that, you know, we can look at the work of the 60s of forcing the South to integrate from a federal standpoint. When we know an individual state is doing wrong, we do have an opportunity, and in my opinion, as state leaders, a responsibility to put pressure on our federal government to take a look at what the states are doing and enact legislation that forces them to do the right thing. And I know that that is difficult, and it kind of goes against the "you can't make me do anything" aesthetic of not just Unitarian Universalists, but United States citizens or United States residents. But I think it's important that throwing up our hands and saying, oh, there's nothing that we can do with Texas, Texas is going to be Texas, isn't really true. And it somehow absolves us of feeling this urgency around doing the things that we can do.
You know, it's interesting to me, the theological underpinning to this work is interdependence. It needs to matter to me that the people of Palau will be underwater if we don't act, because their fate and my fate are interdependent. Unless we stop their nation from going underwater, we have failed. All of humanity has failed. It matters to me in New York that injustice is happening in Texas because our communities are interdependent, or we need to theologically understand that interdependence. interdependence. It matters that extinction is happening with species all over the planet too, because our fates are interdependent. It matters what's happening in the ocean because of climate change and ocean warming, because the oceans connect the whole planet. And so there's this theological piece under it that to me is interdependence. That like my liberation and the liberation of the people in prisons are bound together inseparably.
Yes, and to further your point, the reason it matters that those places don't go underwater isn't because of what it means for us in extreme weather and climate change in our areas. It matters because we cannot build heaven on earth knowing that we're condemning entire societies to be underwater, right? Even if everything was fine where we are, it doesn't matter. We're still not liberated if the least of us among us aren't liberated, right? A lot of times, I think in Unitarian Universalism, I hear environmentalism and climate change couched in, if we don't take care of them, that just means it's going to be so much worse for us. And while that may be true, it's not the reason why we do this work, right? We do this work because we know that there before the grace of God goes I. And that privilege that has been given to us, we are obligated to use for others.
There's a prevention aspect of this too. I've been listening a little bit to this idea about continual progress, that maybe sustainability does not require that. In fact, maybe continuous progress is a detriment to sustainability. So people have a right to exist with a certain integrity of the environment and the community and the surrounding communities. Of course, you all know the idea of communities is that communities can live and exist with their own cultural integrity. If what we're doing puts that at risk, then we need to hold ourselves accountable for our actions. And because we live in a capitalist culture, people's right to that kind of safety and integrity, it goes on the back burner. It's far less important than the idea of progress and profits. And that is just so destructive. Michael, you mentioned the oceans. We are destroying the oceans, plastic, trash, pharmaceuticals. So it's not even just global warming. It's what we're doing. And if you go beneath the water, there are just the most beautiful, delicate, fragile environments. And, it's like we don't care. Out of sight, out of mind. We have a much bigger accountability than we have called ourselves to. And again, it goes back to me over and over again in terms of this country. The right to vote makes all the difference in the world, because public policy is the thing that we have a hard time fighting against, right? Once that policy is set, a lot of people are just kind of complacent and complicit in a sense that we don't do the work to turn those policies around. It does feel bigger. It feels big and unmanageable. But if we manage the right to vote, then a lot of those things will become manageable. So if we're really smart about where we put our efforts, we want to make sure that people's votes count so that people can vote in their best interest.
One thing I want to mention, what Chris just said and what Paula just said brings me to the Create Climate Justice initiative. That's our denominational call to do this work intersectionally. And one of our priorities is to catalyze the just transition to an ecological civilization. And there's many, many frameworks for what the just transition means, but the one that I always point to is from the Climate Justice Alliance. But the first principle of a just transition that they speak to is buen vivir, a good life. And they define that buen vivir means that we can live well without living better at the expense of others. Workers, community residents, women, and indigenous peoples around the world have a fundamental human right to clean, healthy, and adequate air, water, land, food, education, and shelter. We must have just relationships with each other and with the natural world of which we are a part. The rights of peoples, communities, and nature must supersede the rights of the individual. This is one way that you can see these parallels between Unitarian Universalist values and the values of the climate justice movement that we are called to work with, align ourselves with, and be a part of. So I just want to lift that up as one of the ways that we're doing the work together. And I also want to mention, here we are with 15 minutes left, and we haven't talked about the BIPOC Caucus for Climate Justice, Paula, that you're a co-convener of. So I wondered if we might make a little time to speak to how UUs of color are engaging on this intersection of the 8th and 7th principles.
But let me say first that the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Caucus of UU Ministry for the Earth, it actually came together in a retreat, spring of 2018. And UU Ministry for Earth wanted to do their work in a way that was creative, transformative, more inclusive. So we had a very strong caucus as a part of that retreat. In the retreat, UU Ministry for Earth adopted the 8th principle, because I think we understood that we needed to kind of carve out another conceptual theological space for a full dialogue between us, right? So that happened, and UUMFE was one of the earliest adopters of the 8th principle. So we've been forming a BIPOC caucus. And it's interesting, we've got a lot of representation of various ethnic identities, cultural identities in the caucus. One of the things that it was a kind of an aha moment for me, as we form this new caucus, the work of inclusion is like everything in the beginning. After 20-something years, what I realize is we really haven't done much of this work in our association. We come into spaces that already exist, and we're not starting from the ground up to establish a truly multiculturally inclusive community at the onset. And I think it's out of consciousness for people because the space is already there. And I'm not sure that I would have even realized it without being in this role, starting a new group. So that's one thing, is that we have a lot of learning to do as we adjust and transform culturally. So that's one piece. The 8th principle will help us to do that. And I am seeing in many different places where congregations are either working on the 8th principle, other groups like UUs for Social Justice and State Action Networks, but where they're either working to adopt the 8th principle or where they already have adopted the 8th principle. It's like we are gaining access to a realm of Unitarian Universalism that was, in a sense, kind of dormant, just like beyond the daily reach of people. It's really exciting. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we are going to see and experience a transformation that folks just aren't even ready for. And it'll be a good one. We have done as much as we could have done within the context and with the principles centered as we've had them. The 8th principle calls us into a truly inclusive way of living out and applying those 8th principles. And we are just beginning that process. The work that Blue has done, the work that Drum has done is definitely there. But in terms of what's central to the average Unitarian Universalist space, we are just stepping into a new realm. It's quite exciting.
2 questions from some folks that are watching, Darby and Natalie, and they're kind of intersecting questions of, as congregations and communities move to accept the 8th principle, what would they need to be doing? What are some first steps that they could be doing to engage with this work, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a race perspective, and understanding the intersectionality between race and environment?
And the other oppressions as well. So it's important to introduce it in your congregation where you bring more and more people into the conversation, so that the time between when you suggest the 8th principle and that you actually schedule it for a vote, people have had a chance to explore their own thoughts and feelings, hear from other people, And it's an important period for awareness and people being able to hear why it's important and how other people feel about it. So we have more than just our own reactions. Some people's initial reactions are like, we don't need that. Why do we need it? We have the 7 principles. Well, yeah, for many people who are already here, they don't need. Some of us do. And we all do, whether we are aware of it or not. And so you have to give people a chance to have that initial reaction and then hear more and give and have consideration. That's one piece. I think you want to work with your board and your ministers. You want your church leadership to be on board. They don't have to lead the process, but you want their support for it. And what does it take to get a resolution passed in your congregation? It's different in different congregations. Once you take your vote, of course, you let us know so we can add you to the list. That's important. We need to be thinking about, once the 8th principle is embraced by our congregation or our organization, what does it mean when we begin to look at our work and our relationships through that 8th principle? Does your mission need to change? Does your covenant need to be rewritten? Probably yes, right? Is your vision for the church different? What about your policies and your practices? If you're in a congregation, you've got worship and religious education, and every aspect of the church needs to then be reconsidered with the 8th principle as a part of your lens. Now, there may be things that don't change, but I'm willing to bet you that there's room for a lot of change. We have an 8th principle learning community that meets monthly. Again, this work is very young, and those changes that we're talking about, we're going to discover in time. But the learning community meets monthly. I encourage you to get on the mailing list so that you can come to those meetings. They're great. They're resources. We get to learn from each other. Those who have already passed it, those who are working on governance, those who have exciting things happening in religious education and worship. And, something I've thought about, I would love to do a simulation of a congregation, not brick and mortar, not real, but a simulation of a congregation where the 8th principle has been applied across the board. If we can kind of create, what that model might look like, then I think it'll help inform a lot more people.
I know lots of our congregations are passionate about environmental issues, if not yet environmental justice, because they don't quite get the difference between those. But I'm wondering if there are ways that UU Ministry for the Earth can help those congregations that already embrace the 7th principle so much, make that connection more easily and more directly.
Absolutely. There's a few tools and resources that I'll begin with. The BIPOC Caucus for Climate Justice of UU Ministry for Earth has meetings that are open to anybody. White people too can come and participate in the conversation. That's a multicultural program open to anyone. And these are spaces, it's important that those people who have been marginalized for centuries are centered as part of what it means to pass the 8th principle. So showing up for those BIPOC Caucus programs that you're invited to and welcome to come to is one way to begin. Your whole climate or green sanctuary team is welcome to come and then to talk about it and debrief it together. We also have a curriculum that was published about 10 years ago. Hopefully we'll release a new edition soon, but it's called Our Place in the Web of Life. And this curriculum is focused on looking at where your church is, where your power comes from, where your waste goes to, and whose communities are being impacted by the coal power plant, where the coal comes from, and starting to see the life of your church, how it is connected to other communities and to environmental justice issues. And then the next step from there is, how do you actually meet the organizers in those communities? How do you actually meet the people who are trying to transform your energy grid so that that coal plant doesn't pollute that community anymore? Relationship is so key. Like, you will never fully understand environmental racism if you're not in relationship to people who are experiencing it, who are suffering because of it. And so I know many congregations will think we don't have any EJ communities near us. That's probably not true. You just don't know about them yet. And yeah, they may be small and they may be struggling because of a really big history of genocide, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. You know, maybe you have to drive an hour. But I know chief of a tribe that I work with would drive 12 hours across the country to be at a gathering before the pandemic. It reframed my thinking around this. How far are we willing to go? How deep is our commitment to one another? And to see someone who was willing to drive across the entire continent to be at a gathering when so many of us are like, oh, they live across the river. You know, it just really is something to question in ourselves, something to unpack in terms of you know, what are the real barriers to our connection? And then what are the ones that we're imposing by our comfort, you know? So that's kind of where I would start. There's also the Justice on Earth book that Paula is one of the contributing authors to. There's a discussion guide for that was published by the UUA. And please join Ministry for Earth's newsletter. We have workshops, webinars, convergences of congregational leaders all the time, you know, so we would love to continue to build and be in relationship as we grow and deepen our commitment to the eighth principle within how we do environmental and climate work.
This is a good time to revive seventh principle groups and congregations, because if they start to look at the seventh principle and the eighth principle together, they're going to have new revelations, new work to do.
Well, thank you both so much for being here today. Our guests, Allie and Paula. Thanks, Michael, for being here. We will see you next week, same time, same place. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It's because of you that our ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/podcast for more information. If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, to rate it, and to review it so that others can find us. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day.